Have you ever noticed that many times the best results come right when we stop worrying so much? Why do opportunities seem to arise when we stop desperately seeking them? And why does the peace we long for only appear when we stop trying to control it? This paradox follows us. We spend our lives believing we need to fight, plan, and worry to achieve what we want. But what if it's the opposite? What if our obsession with control is what really prevents us from living fully? Michel de Montaigne, that brilliant and somewhat rebellious thinker, offers a very interesting answer to this. He lived in a turbulent time, lost friends and family, faced illnesses, and saw his world turned upside down. However, it was precisely when he stopped trying to control everything that he found a freedom few achieve. Montaigne wasn't a preacher of absolute truths. On the contrary, his philosophy was an invitation to doubt, experimentation, and above all, detachment. He teaches us that by freeing ourselves from the need for certainty and control, we open space for something much more powerful, tranquility and authenticity. In this video, we'll explore how Montaigne's philosophy can help us live without the burden of constant worry. We'll discover why letting go of so much attachment might be the secret to a lighter life and, curiously, a life with more meaning, as Montaigne himself asked, "What do I know?" Michel de Montaigne was born in 1533 in a France marked by religious wars, political intrigue, and instability. From a young age, his life was shaped by two opposing forces, privilege and tragedy. The son of a wealthy family, he received an exceptional education, mastering Latin from childhood and being exposed to the best ideas of his time. But no privilege can shield us from the reality of life, loss, pain, and uncertainty. At the age of 30, Montaigne was forced to face the brutality of existence in an intense and relentless way. His best friend, Etienne de la, died suddenly, leaving him devastated. Soon after, his father also passed away, and shortly thereafter, a strange accident took his brother's life. He was struck in the head by a tennis ball. As if that weren't enough, Montaigne himself had a near-death experience when he fell off a horse at high speed. To seal this period of suffering, his newborn daughter died shortly after coming into the world. Imagine going through all that in a short time. Imagine feeling like the world is crumbling around you, that the fragility of existence becomes impossible to ignore. Montaigne could have gone mad. He could have given in to despair. But instead, he made a radical decision to abandon public life and isolate himself on his property in the countryside, where he would spend years in contemplation and writing. In his private library, surrounded by more than 1,500 books, Montaigne found something few ever find, a space for inner freedom. He realized that nothing in the outside world could guarantee him stability or absolute security. The only thing he could truly control was his own mind, his way of seeing and reacting to the world. It was there, in the midst of silence and solitude, that he began to write his famous essays, texts in which he did not seek to teach absolute truths but to explore his own experiences, his mistakes, doubts, and contradictions. For Montaigne, self-knowledge wasn't a quest for perfection, but a continuous exercise in accepting uncertainty. Montaigne discovered that suffering largely comes from our illusion of control. We believe we can predict the future, avoid pain, and shape the world to our will. But the truth is, we have control over very little. The secret to peace, according to him, is not trying to control life, but learning to live with its unpredictability. Montaigne's decision to step away from the world wasn't an act of surrender, but of liberation. He didn't flee from life. He learned to live it in a way that made sense to him, away from politics, social obligations, and external expectations. He found a space where he could simply be. And perhaps this is one of the greatest lessons we can learn from his story. Sometimes we need to step away from the noise of the world to find our own voice. And when we stop worrying so much about pleasing others, when we stop trying to meet external expectations, we find a kind of freedom that no one can take away from us. What if everything we believe to be true is nothing more than a comfortable illusion? What if our incessant search for certainties is, in fact, the root of our anxiety? Michel de Montaigne didn't seek absolute truths, and perhaps that's why he's one of the freest philosophers to ever exist. His most famous question, "What do I know?" wasn't just an intellectual gesture of humility. It was an invitation to a new way of living. For him, tranquility wasn't about having all the answers, but learning to live with uncertainty. Since ancient times, philosophers have tried to define the best path to a fulfilling life. The Stoics defended self-control and acceptance of fate. The Epicureans believed that pleasure and simplicity were the keys to happiness. Montaigne, on the other hand, took a different path. He distrusted any philosophy that promised definitive answers. Montaigne was inspired by skepticism, a philosophical movement that questioned humanity's ability to reach absolute truths. For him, there was no one right way to live or one single explanation for life. The world was an uncertain, fluid place, full of contradictions. And the true wise person was one who learned to navigate that uncertainty without trying to reduce it to fixed formulas. This view contrasts sharply with how many people live today. We are in a constant search for certainties. We want definitive answers to our problems. We seek infallible advice. We want to know what to do to guarantee success, happiness, and recognition. But this obsession with control only makes us more anxious. Montaigne offers us something different, to accept that we don't know everything, and that's okay. He believed the human mind is limited and fallible, and that our intellectual arrogance often causes more suffering than benefit. In his essays, he mocks the great intellectuals of his time, showing that, in the end, even the wisest people are vulnerable to the same illusions and weaknesses as anyone else. He writes, "Our judgment is so fragile that, most of the time, it gets lost in the dark. What is truth for one is error for another." This idea may be uncomfortable for some, but it's also liberating. If everything is uncertain, then we don't have to carry the burden of trying to have all the answers. If our opinions and beliefs may be wrong, we can be lighter, more open to dialogue, and more flexible in life. Moreover, Montaigne believed that accepting uncertainty makes us less rigid, less dogmatic, and, above all, more tolerant. He lived through a time of violent religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, and realized that much of human suffering stemmed from our inability to accept that we might be wrong. By abandoning the illusion of certainty, Montaigne found something rare, true peace of mind. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't have to defend his view of the world as the only correct one, nor cling to fixed beliefs that could become prisons. He simply observed, experimented, and learned, without the need to reach a definitive conclusion in the end. Montaigne teaches us that tranquility doesn't come from certainty, but from lightness in the face of uncertainty. When we stop worrying so much about being right, we can finally breathe. What would happen if you suddenly stopped worrying so much about what others think? If you stopped measuring your worth by success or failure? If you accepted that life is uncertain and fluid, and that the true secret isn't in controlling everything but in adapting. For Montaigne, life wasn't a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. He learned this through practice. He saw friends and family die suddenly, faced illnesses, and survived an accident that almost cost him his life. After all this, he understood that existence is fragile and that excessive attachment to the future is a trap. That's why he decided to completely change his approach to life. He withdrew to the countryside, abandoned his political ambitions, and began living in the present, writing and reflecting on the human condition without the pressure of achieving big goals. But don't be mistaken. This doesn't mean Montaigne advocated for a life of passivity or indifference. Quite the opposite. He wasn't a fatalist who accepted everything without question, nor a nihilist who believed that nothing had meaning. What he proposed was something much more subtle and powerful: active detachment. He believed we should act, strive, and pursue what we want, but without becoming slaves to the result. In other words, we should do everything we can, but without despairing if things don't turn out as expected. He wrote, "There is no favorable wind for those who don't know where they're going." That's the key. Have direction, but don't obsess over the destination. Montaigne believed that those who learn to deal with the unpredictability of life become lighter, wiser, and happier. After all, the more we try to control everything, the more we suffer when things inevitably fall out of our control. If you look at your own life, you might realize that the moments when you felt most free and happy were those when you let go of excessive worry. Maybe it was when you decided not to care so much about other people's opinions, when you stopped forcing a situation, or simply when you accepted things as they are. Montaigne reminds us that life happens in the now, and that often excessive attachment to the future prevents us from seeing the beauty of the present. He wrote, "He who fixes his happiness on the future condemns himself to eternal unhappiness." Does this mean we should give up our desires and ambitions? No, it simply means we need to learn to let go, to flow with life instead of fighting against it. And paradoxically, when we do this, things start to happen more naturally. Results come, not because we're obsessed with them, but because we stop putting so much pressure on ourselves. Montaigne teaches us that true freedom isn't in conquering the world, but in conquering ourselves. And to achieve this, we must learn to live without attachment, with lightness, curiosity, and the willingness to accept what life brings us in the end. Montaigne's great lesson is simple. Stop trying to control everything and learn to live. But like everything that seems simple, this idea hides an immense depth. After all, how can we really detach ourselves from the need for certainty, success, and control? Montaigne doesn't offer us a magic formula or a single path. On the contrary, he invites us to experiment, observe ourselves, and accept our contradictions. For him, life isn't a straight line, but a series of unexpected curves. The true wisdom is in learning to navigate them without despair. He teaches us that the obsession with certainty only makes us more anxious, that the search for recognition imprisons us, that trying to control everything distances us from what really matters, and that paradoxically, when we stop worrying so much, the results come because by freeing ourselves from the need for approval, we begin to act more authentically. By letting go of the obsession with success, we become more creative and spontaneous. By accepting that life is uncertain, we finally find peace. Montaigne lived and died faithful to this thought. His last years were spent writing, exploring his ideas, and observing life as it is, without illusions, without pretensions, without masks. He understood that the greatest human error is taking ourselves too seriously, and that the secret to a full life is not in seeking definitive answers, but in learning to ask the right questions. So, I ask you, what if, from now on, you started living without the constant burden of worry? What if you stopped trying to prove something to others? What if you simply accepted uncertainty and started living in the present? Maybe, like Montaigne, you'll discover that true freedom isn't in controlling the world, but in liberating yourself from yourself. If you've made it this far, it means that, in some way, this conversation made sense to you, and that's powerful. After all, we live in an era where we're constantly bombarded with information, demands, and expectations. Stopping to reflect on a different path, a lighter and freer path, is already a huge step. Michel de Montaigne teaches us that we don't need to have all the answers, that life doesn't have to be a constant struggle to prove something to someone, that we can simply live, and that alone is a revolution. If this video made you think differently, tell me in the comments, which part of Montaigne's philosophy resonated most with you? Do you feel you worry too much about things you can't control? What would your life look like if you could relax a little more and trust the flow of things? And, of course, if you like these kinds of reflections, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. That helps me keep bringing you content like this. Oh, and since we're talking about detachment and freedom, there's another video here on the screen that might interest you, but I won't tell you what it's about. You'll have to click to find out. Who knows, maybe it'll give you a new perspective too. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.